Alrighty, today we're talking presentation tips for SPUR 2021. Here's the video to accompany this professional development session. Just going to try to give you some really quick and easy rules of thumb for making your presentations more engaging and do what you hope they want you want them to do, and avoiding some of the common challenges and difficulties with these presentations. That's what we're going to try to do in this video. So first, you want to start with the question, what's the puzzle or problem? A lot of ways to start a presentation. Often you can get kind of hung up on, how should I start this? I could start it anywhere. You can start really broad, right? Like, people need to have relationships, right? In a really broad sense. And it's probably too broad. Too specific might be researcher X found this, researcher Y found this, and we're going to put them together and find Z, right? Too specific, related to a set of really specific questions for individual researchers. You're not doing that. What you're doing is you're identifying a problem, potentially a problem in society, a problem in how people relate to each other, a problem in group conflict, a problem in understanding the self and mental health, something like that, right? And ground your presentation there. So ground your presentation in a problem or puzzle, and you're trying to solve that with this work. So you ground it by talking about the problem, what the problem is, who it affects, how it affects them, and then working towards, with an eye towards, the topic that you're studying. All right, second tip. Why should your audience care? Typically, when you're doing research, you have a pretty good idea of why you care about a topic, right? I care about it because it's personally relevant to me. I have a lot of personal stories that are really consistent with having this kind of problem in my life, and I want to study that myself. That's fine. That's good, actually. But in the context of a presentation, you don't want to answer why you care. You want to answer why the audience should care, right? And so sometimes that's really about like creating an empathy bridge. So you're trying to get people to understand why the audience should care about something, why they should care about this particular problem that you've identified. So you start by talking about a problem. You might talk about who it affects, how many people it affects. You might talk about what that problem causes downstream. What are the implications of this problem for any number of things that people are likely to care about? Could be politics, could be teamwork, any way that this kind of like understanding how people think about something, if we're in psychology realm, influences the kinds of big things that we might care about, right? So in my work, I talk about inequality a lot and how inequality harms people, right? Could harm people at the top of the hierarchies, could harm people at the bottom. Could make people inaccurate about the world around them, could make people unresponsive and unempathic to the suffering of people in the world. And these are problems that the audience should care about, not just me. So that's the level of analysis you want to try and move towards. All right. Third question, how does your work help us with this puzzle problem? Right, so you've got this problem that you're developing. You're talking about how people might care about it. Third piece is, how does your work help solve this puzzle or problem, right? So here you don't want to be shy about it. You want to talk about how your work is really important to understanding and eventually solving this problem. You're not solving it on your own with a single set of studies, right? But you are basically paving a path towards solving this problem. One of the pieces on the path is understanding psychology in the context of this problem. So that's what you want to say here. You want to talk about why this particular set of studies, this method, this approach is necessary to understanding this puzzle and eventually downstream solving this problem, all right? So, your introduction basically involves these three steps. Here, you're talking about this work, in particular, the measures, maybe the theory, the measures that you're using or going to use, and all of that is meant to, talk about how your work here, the way you've analyzed it, the way you're studying it, is going to help you with this puzzle and problem. So number 4 is not just to tell people what you did, right? So you want to tell people what you did, but there's various ways to do that, right? You can tell people in the most technical terms, right? You can talk about p-values and test statistics and the kinds of regressions that you're doing. You can talk about sampling and the kinds of sampling and experimental or quasi-experimental designs. But what you really don't want to lose sight of is that the people who are listening to your presentation are audience members, and they may come from different disciplines. They may have different training, may not be uniquely familiar with the kind of work and analysis that you're engaged in. So what that means is that you need to take a step back, reduce some of the assumptions that you have that people know what you're going to be doing, and really tell your auntie what you did, right? And your aunt may have no idea what you've been up to, does not have a degree in psychology, won't understand some of the constructs that you talk about, but maybe can understand at a certain level, right? And you want to pitch at that level when you're thinking about what you did, right? So there are many ways to use language to reduce the complexity of what you're saying, to increase the understandability of what you're saying, right? So try doing things like, instead of calling your participants subjects or participants, you can call them people. Instead of talking about the experimental design, so I ran an experiment where we did these two conditions, you might say, you might actually, instead of just doing that, you might say, we exposed people to this condition where this happened to them, they read something, they acted out something, they learned about something, you describe what they learned, and then half the people were assigned to a different condition where they learned about something else, or read about something else, or acted out something else, right? And you do it in these terms to give people the sense of what the experience of the people in the experiment was. That experience then leads to what you measured, right? And so we did this attitude survey, we did the SKIP attitude survey, but that's an abbreviation. The abbreviation is maybe not the best way to convey the information. Instead of doing the abbreviation, you want to explain what that abbreviation means. You want to give people examples of the items. All of this gives your aunt a really good sense of what you did in the study, who the people were, and what specifically the questions were that they answered. All right, very different level of analysis than maybe you would to the people in your lab that you're working with, right? Where there's tons of shared information and shared knowledge. This is not the case in a presentation. In a presentation, you need to bring people to where you're at. And so you need to create a level of shared knowledge and information. And that's your job as the presenter, to be descriptive in a way that someone without a degree in social science could follow. All right, still talking to your auntie. Tell your auntie what you learned and what you might do next. So after you've described what you did and described what you found, people in condition A did this slightly more than people in condition B, but they didn't do this differently in the two conditions. What we've learned so far is this, right? And you could say that, this has implications for a literature and for a theory. That's a way to talk to other scientists about what you learned. But you want to talk about what you learned to this audience that you're trying to draw in that doesn't share that kind of level of analysis. So you want to talk in terms of what we learned is when people are in these kinds of situations where this happens to them versus situations where this happens to them, they respond in this way X, right? And that's a way to describe this that's not beholden to the particular literatures that are happening. It's really describing what happened to people in your experiment. Now, what you might do next is interesting because what you need to do is you need to talk about like some of the challenges, right? So in some ways, what you do next is just study it again. That's often what we do in social science. And so, talking about why you have to study it again, right? Like talking about how this was a single study with a certain group of people. And so it worked for them, but I'm not sure if it's going to work for, say, I don't know, a sample of older folks, a sample of people who are, not convenient sample folks online through Mechanical Turk, but are, maybe university students, maybe fully employed, working in an industry where this happens a lot, that sort of thing. So you want to think about what you're doing next. It might be just doing it again. You might be doing it again in a sample that is more directly relevant to the population at large, to other people who didn't fall in the first sample. There might be a problem in your experiment, right? Like you created this experiment, you created this study, and you had certain assumptions involved, right? Like you're examining, high X versus low X as your experiment. And so maybe you're interested in not just high X and low X, but there might be a confound, right? Y. And so I want to account for Y. So I'm also going to, in my next study, I'm going to manipulate Y. So it's going to be high X, high Y, low Y. And then you might study it in those terms, right? So that's a future direction. This might be just a correlational study that you've done, an initial data set. So it's great in terms of the richness of the samples that you have and all the different correlational variables that you're controlling for. The next step might be to decide whether or not these relationships are in one direction or another. So that might lead to an experiment in the future. You've done a qualitative analysis, right? So you have a really clear sense of the mechanisms of this psychological process in this small group of people, and you're wondering how much it generalizes or not. So you might be looking to study it in a different context to surface some of the challenges. These are all ways to talk about what you might do next. And it's just really important to remember that it's not just social sciences you're talking about. So why do you have to do it again? Why is the experiment limited? Why is the correlational study limited? And what might the next study do? Remember, you talked about a problem initially. So what you do next might be, what you need to do next to further address the problem. And so you can think about it in those terms, right? So, you've figured out like why people have this bias, but the next step is to reduce that bias. And so that's another way to think about how to talk about what you do next. Is think about this problem and how you take the steps to continue to try and solve that problem using science. All right, so an example from my own work, just to give you a sense of this. So what's the problem? This is a paper, The Misperception of Racial Economic Inequality, that we wrote. And I'll take you through how I might describe it in a presentation, answering these questions and responding to these prompts in our tips, right? So the first one, what's the problem? People in the US seem to be committed to racial equality, even if it doesn't exist, and they think it'll just happen automatically. So that's the problem. So that's the problem we want to address. Why should this audience care? It's very clear that I care about it, but why does this audience care? And so we just draw the logic out and we say, if we think equality is just going to happen automatically, we won't necessarily do anything about the racism here and now, right? Because we think it's going to be over eventually, over time. That's an assumption that I don't think we can fully believe, given the state of the world. So that's why the audience should care, right? If we think things are going to just improve, then we won't do anything, and we probably need to do something. So how does the work help us with this problem? What we do in the work is we try to determine how inaccurate people's beliefs are about levels of racial inequality in society and any of the psychological correlates. So what are the things that people believe that predict these tendencies to overestimate progress towards racial equality and current racial equality? And when we talk about what we did, what we have is this sample of Americans. It's just people across the United States, and representative of the United States in terms of income and racial demographics. We ask them to make estimates of the level of racial inequality in society. We have the scale that's 0 to 200. It says if white families have 100 of wealth, how much do Black families have on average? And they do those ratings at different time points, and then we measure those ratings against actual statistics collected by the federal government on actual wealth differences between Black and white families. We compare that difference to see how off people are and how much people are likely to overestimate racial equality and progress towards it. Tell us what you learned and what's next. Well, what we learn is that people are way off in terms of their perceptions. They think society, American society, is more equal than it actually is. We have some information about why that might be in those studies. Certainly status is related to it. So people who are higher in status, so more successful in society or closer to success in society in terms of race, in terms of income, tend to be more likely to see equality. So there's this motivated component. There's also this tendency for people who believe that the world is fair and just also tend to think that things are more equal. So there's this evidence that there's really justifying ideologies that are at play there. Next, a number of next steps that we might do. We might want to replicate the study with different samples. We might want to do it with different populations. One of the things that we've been working on subsequently is trying to make people more accurate, right? So we know that people are really inaccurate. What might make people more able to see racial inequality in society? So that's the next step that we might engage in based on this work. All right. So visuals, a few additional notes. Visuals are important. They should be balanced and focused. What that means is less text. Don't get too preoccupied with doing all the citations for all the things. If you're going to do citations, I encourage you to reduce the font of the citations so that they don't overwhelm you with text. White space is a key, or negative space, so that space that doesn't have busyness on it is key. And you want things to be balanced so it's not distracting, right? So this clown is distracting from the message, right? It's making you think of other things, and not that visuals should be balanced and focused. So think about your visuals in that way, so you don't overwhelm your presentation with things that maybe distract from the message. So people in the audience may be thinking, why is this clown here? So this is an extreme example, but it's definitely something that happens. Visuals can be balanced and focused. I think this one does a better job than the clown because it's it's sort of underlining the text here. And you see there's not a lot of words on this page, and what you've got is a focus on what's happening here, and people will have less, I think, fewer questions about why is the line there. All right. Avoiding too much text, I said a second ago, but I'm serious about it. White space is key. Space out your bullet points so that there's, so in this case, there's white space, but negative space. So any space where there's no text is good. You want to have that. You want it to be balanced. Consistent punctuation and fonts. So don't get overwhelmed with the punctuation. You can leave your bullet points and not as complete sentences, but as abbreviated summaries. That'll reduce the text. And then often cite with smaller text so you help to not busy up the slides. So here I'm citing myself with slightly smaller font. Be consistent across your slides. Consistent text sizes. Consistent text types. That sort of thing is important, and looks, I think, increases the visual appeal of your slides in general. And with that, that's the end of this presentation on tips for giving an effective presentation. I hope it was engaging and helpful for you as you're navigating your presentations for SPUR and beyond. And if you have questions about it, feel free to contact me on Slack or on email, whatever's best for you. Thanks for listening. It's been a pleasure. Bye.